Your photography often explores the human relationship with the natural world and the space between fact and fiction. Can you talk about why these themes are important to you and how you approach capturing them in your work?
I think that our relationship to the environment that we live in shapes us from the ground up. And sometimes I think that these forces are invisible. You can't see someone's history just from a portrait. But I often use kind of analog techniques to be able to show these parts that are unseen. So, for instance, in the past, I've made a project about trying to explore the idea of a picture of health, and using the, bodily fluids to transform the nature of the film itself to be able to allude to this other world that we can't see. And I think, it's incredibly important to be able to situate humanity in this greater ecosystem, that we aren't just islands, that every single person is connected to every other person. So a lot of my work, I try to talk about kind of social issues or political issues, but in a way that is, I suppose, relatable. Because it's really difficult, I think, sometimes when you're reading a headline in a newspaper and reading statistics to actually be able to identify with the subject matter that you're looking at. And so I'm always trying to find new ways of considering the way that those individuals are situated within that greater ecosystem and how to kind of elucidate these hidden threads. And so, I kind of employ so many different techniques, but I'm always trying to find new ways. So I'm trying to think about the visible light spectrum, or maybe it's about how do you show someone's deep stress in an image. Maybe you're using the sweat of their body, or maybe you are talking about pollution and you're using fracking fluid to damage the surface of the picture to allude to what a risk to clean water would look like. So I'm always trying to find ways of being able to have these very, very large concepts that are often so difficult to grasp, but be able to make like a visually arresting image that, everyone can understand, because photography is such a ubiquitous language. We see it on billboards, we see it on our phones scrolling through Instagram, we see it all the time, So there's this kind of universality to the image. And of course, coming from this place now where we're about to go to space, you can kind of look at the blue marble image as being the kind of the origins of the environmental movement. And sometimes it takes one image to be an incredibly powerful tool to mobilize, a new way of thinking. And I think quite often, we as humans, it's very difficult for us to take in huge amounts of information from all these sources and to be able to parse it into something that is quantifiable. But an image has this capability of being the shorthand, and it's such an impactful, instant, visceral reaction. And so, all of my photography is about kind of exploring this kind of intersection. And I came from a background which was pretty non-traditional. I didn't study photography. I studied English literature. So all of my work is actually very research heavy. I come at it from a very kind of rigorous research perspective, which doesn't always necessarily show in the finished product. But that's the kind of, the process that I go through to realize these quite simple methods. So I go through many kind of trial processes to reach a point where it seems like such a simple thing, but it's gone through this very, very complex process of trial and error and research and speaking to scientists and experts to be able to kind of allude to a world that's beyond that frame.
Your work often involves immersing yourself in different communities and cultures. What do you think are the benefits of this approach to photography, and what challenges have you encountered along the way?
I mean, it's a very slow way of working. I think that that's quite liberating because you allow the project to take on its own shape in its own time. And I think otherwise, if you do stuff over a very short space of time and you parachute into a community, you're bringing with yourself a whole set of baggage and stereotypes and expectations, which are often false. You're creating this idea of a project in real time and being able to understand people's concerns. And I think in that way, it allows me to free myself from my own bias. And I think in order to make very honest, meaningful, and impactful work, you have to kind of get rid of so many of your own hang-ups. Because I think that that's often the critique of so much, photojournalism, is that, what place is that person coming from? Why is that the correct person to tell the story? And I think these are really important questions to ask. And so whenever I'm making work, I'm always trying to think like, why is it that I am the one telling this story? And how can I most identify with my subjects? How can I be most, impactful in their lives? How can I use this story to help them to move to a new place, or to tell an aspect of a story that perhaps hasn't been told, or to enable a kind of, an empathy? And sometimes this manifests itself not only just in the project, but it means that sometimes I can go into a community of very, very lonely people that are very, isolated from the world, and I can form friendships. And that's sometimes more impactful than even the photo project at the end of it. Sometimes it's actually the stages along the way that mean that that project has impact. And I think impact can be thought of on a very, very small scale or on a very big scale. Of course, my goal always is to make books or exhibitions that people will come and they will experience and they will kind of live through this story. But I think it's impossible to make truly objective work. I think, part of making impactful work is making it personal, is really caring about the subject matter. And I think doing stuff over a long period of time and in remote communities or working very closely with people, it enables you to kind of take on their concerns and their hopes and their dreams in a way that makes that work kind of honest and true on some level. And so when a viewer comes along and sees that project, they can identify with it because there's this kernel of humanity that runs through it. And I think that's very difficult to achieve when you come in with a lot of baggage and you have an expectation of how that project is going to be, because you're just like ticking off the list. And the way that I'm working, it's just to reach that kind of kernel of humanity, the thing that unites us rather than the things that divide us. And I think we're living in a world now which is incredibly polarized. There are so many opinions on this side and so many opinions on this side, and it's like shouting over a void. And every single time I go into a community, I try to go in with an openness to be a blank canvas, to be receptive and not to be closed down, and to be able to listen to other people's points of view and to be able to understand the kind of the why. Why are we at the place we're at? So I always look back at the history, and sometimes, I made this project on Pitcairn Island, which I'll talk about in a minute. But in order to understand that project, you really need to look back at the history of why that place ever had people there, or you need to look back at British politics and history at that time. And all of these things have an impact in the present day. And so I'm interested in kind of conflating those two parts, the history and the present, and being able to use myself as a kind of a conduit, as a mouthpiece, to be able to bring those disparate threads together and to kind of contextualize the present moment.
And of all the projects you've worked on, is there one that stands out as particularly special or meaningful to you? And can you tell us a bit more about what made that project unique and why it is important to you?
Yeah, I would say that Pitcairn project is probably the project that I'm most proud of. It took me an extremely long time to realize. I mean, I shot the pictures in 2015. So often people are saying, oh, I made the project in 2015, but I published it last year. And I would argue that all of that process from 2015 until 2022 was part of the work, actually. So much of that project was about doing the research. And so it even began before 2015. But to give you a rundown, Pitcairn Island is a 2 mile by 1 mile lump of rock in the South Pacific Ocean. It's situated halfway between Chile and New Zealand. And it's Britain's last remaining overseas territory in the Pacific Ocean, and you can reach it only by quarterly supply ship. And it's a volcanic rocky island, so it kind of eschews the archetypal Polynesian paradise. It's quite different. It feels more like Alcatraz. And it became very famous because it's the home of the descendants of the Bounty mutineers. And the Bounty mutiny happened in 1790, and a British ship called the Bounty was tasked with going to the South Seas to pick up breadfruit plants in order to transport them, number one, back to Kew Gardens for research, but number two, and the main purpose, was to grow breadfruit plants in the Caribbean to feed the enslaved people there as a staple foodstuff. And the men who were sailors at that time were not treated terribly well, and they reached Polynesia and they thought, I don't want to go back to Britain. And so they ended up on shore for a long period of time, and they had relationships with the local women. And when they were told that they had to leave, they mutinied, and they put the captain in the kind of the ship's skiff with his loyal followers, and the rest of them, they kind of went on the run, and they needed somewhere to hide. And so eventually they found a chart in the captain's cabin, and it had an island on it called Pitcairn Island, which was marked in the wrong place on the map. And they went and spent a very long time looking for it. But in the meantime, they actually had a party on board the boat on one of their stops, and they invited a lot of women aboard and a few Polynesian men. And then they cut the bow line and kind of kidnapped everyone. And these renegades went to go and settle this island. And they eventually arrived there. They burnt the Bounty and they marooned themselves on the island. And so it was this kind of strange marriage of ultimate freedom and ultimate entrapment. On the one hand, you have this idea that this place is entirely free because there was no existing laws, there was no existing rules. But on the other hand, they had no way of leaving. And the people that were there, that was it. So, of course, there were lots of fights broke out. All the men ended up pretty much killing each other after a few years, and there was just one man remaining and a lot of Polynesian women with children, and they were the kind of the founding members of this community. And then this story, because it was the kind of ultimate heroic story, it was this like a white man who was a big hero, who took charge and overthrew this tyrannical captain. And they went to Polynesia, and there were these beautiful bare-chested women, and all of the kind of the archetypes of paradise. This story is a very kind of colonial fantasy, and it was turned into various films. So there was one with Errol Flynn, one with Mel Gibson, one with Clark Gable, one with Marlon Brando. And so every generation has had this reiteration of this fantasy story, and it's a deeply problematic one. These Polynesian women were taken by force. Essentially, they were duped, they were imprisoned. There are records from very early days of the community where the women had tried to escape, and the men had even helped them make a boat, even though they knew that the boat was going to be leaky or that they were not going to be able to sail it. And there was this mocking about it. So I think there was this, back from the very birth of this community, that kind of was born of violence. And then in 2004, the island became very famous because a string of high-profile child sexual abuse trials took place, and 8 of the island men were convicted of child sexual abuse. And it's very easy with stories like this to say everything is bad, everything is good, and to be this really polarizing. And so I try to be this voice to be able to understand like the why did these things develop, and how were these things handled, and how was the handling part of the issue in the way that this had all played out in this narrative, from a government standpoint, and also from the perspective of Hollywood. How much do we as a people have to blame for allowing these things to happen because we want so desperately to believe in this fictional utopia being true that we don't want to see what's right under our noses. And I think that these are kind of lessons that have relevance in all areas of our lives. And this is what I mean about this gap between fact and fiction, because on the one side, you have this gargantuan fiction that we want so desperately to be real. And on the other hand, we have this truth. And actually, this truth, if we had just allowed that to seep in a little bit earlier, we could have made more of that utopian vision come true. But we never allow it to happen. And so I'm very interested in this idea of utopia, I suppose, in a more general sense. In order for a utopia to exist, it means excluding people that don't agree with that idea of utopia. In order for this very, very perfect world to exist, that means that we have to make rules about this person doesn't fit, this person is going to be undermining of our vision, this person is too rebellious. And so you end up with this very amorphous group of people, and often that ends up decaying very quickly because humans desire power, and humans are jealous creatures, they are ambitious. And so by not acknowledging our flaws, we sometimes have this desire to create a utopia, but at the same time, the humanity in all of us is what causes ultimate destruction. And so I'm very interested in this in terms of, even our space trip, because I think, going forwards as we're looking towards going to Mars and, again, colonizing a blank space, you have to ask all these questions of, who do you take? Why those people? What do you want the ultimate vision of humanity to look like? And I think there's something so interesting about using these small examples of, for instance, this very tiny 2 mile by 1 mile lump of rock in the South Pacific, but actually that has so many parallels to the way that we have built, societies, colonial structures. And so I often try to focus on very, very small examples that seemingly niche, but actually allude to much broader issues about society.
And finally, in your opinion, what role can photographic art play in shaping our understanding of the world and the people and places within it?
I think that photographic art in general is one of the most accessible mediums, and it's one of the easiest to disseminate. You can read an image within a fraction of a second, and there's something so impactful about that. To read a piece of text is incredibly impactful, but it takes time, it takes engagement, it takes a certain knowledge of a language. There's a universality about the image, and we're having a lot of discussions right now about AI photography and this truth and lie and fact and fiction, and how much can you trust the image. And I think that, the bridging point of the kind of work that I'm trying to produce, it sort of stands a little bit aside from that, because it is using kind of chemical processes or deep research to kind of create this narrative. And, I'm happy that I've stayed on that side of it rather than being down the incredibly digital route where AI could take over and people would start to question the narrative. But I think there is a huge impact, which, we have to continually reevaluate. I think with all of this, AI rise, I think we're going to have to reevaluate the impact of the photographic image and this idea of truth. But I think ultimately, the photographic image, it is something that can be transmitted around the world in a matter of seconds. It can be something that can be seen in the pages of a book that can be in a library in, several hundred years' time. It can be seen on your phone. There are so many ways of disseminating it that it's incredibly powerful, and it transcends geography, it transcends language, and there is an ease. We all have kind of a fluency, I suppose, with the image. And I think that, images are the things that really have changed the way that we see the world. I remember the New York Times, they did one issue where they took away all of the photography and it was just text. And of course, everyone was up in arms about this, but it was really showing the impact that an image can have and how one picture can just change the course. When you look at very iconic war photographs, for instance, it's changed the way that we perceive that. From the comfort of our sofa in wherever we're living, we suddenly have this image being brought to us, and it mobilizes people. It can change hearts and minds. And I firmly believe in the power of the photographic image. I just hope that it doesn't end up being so eroded that we can no longer tell whether this is something that we should have empathy for. Because right now, I think that it still has this power where, it can instill the sense of empathy, or this, like the blue marble I referred to earlier, is this one world image where we can finally see ourselves in a borderless way. We can see ourselves with no boundaries. We can see ourselves as a whole species. We can see how alone we are. The impact, the psychological impact of that is immeasurable. But I think we are reaching a time where we start having to question these boundaries. And I think, that's also healthy. That the photographic image is also at this point, at this intersection, is encouraging us to continually reevaluate our sense of responsibility to the world and to constantly question the information that we receive as whether it's true or not. And I think that those are important questions to constantly be asking.